Title: Secrets of Sapphire Bay. Chapter 1: A Return to Shadows. The waves lapped against the dock in a slow, rhythmic pulse as Charlotte Charlie Winslow stepped off the ferry. The warm salt air was thick with the scent of jasmine, a fragrance that yanked her back to a time she wasn't sure she wanted to remember. Sapphire Bay had once been her home, her sanctuary. Now it felt like enemy territory. She was back for one reason: her daughter, Lila, and the man who might be her father. Charlie had been 19 when she left this town, and she hadn't looked back until now. She tugged Lila's tiny hand.
"Almost there, baby,"
she murmured, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to reassure more, her daughter or herself. At the top of the pier, standing like a sentinel in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, was him, James Holloway III, the golden boy of Sapphire Bay, the last man she had expected to see, and the one she could never forget. His gaze locked onto hers, cool and assessing, but then it flickered to the child beside her.
"Charlie,"
James said, his voice smooth as a well-aged scotch. She braced herself.
"James."
He looked at Lila again.
"She's yours?"
Charlie lifted her chin.
"Yes."
His jaw flexed.
"And I assume that's why you're here."
Charlie took a breath. She had no idea what the truth was yet. And James? He might be the only one who could tell her. Chapter 2: A Question of Blood. James was used to controlling every aspect of his life: business, family, even love, if one believed his critics. But standing in front of Charlie and the little girl with her stormy blue eyes too familiar to ignore, James felt his grip on control slip through his fingers. He hadn't seen Charlie in 7 years, not since she had disappeared one summer night without a word, and now she was back, with a child who might be his.
"Why now?"
he asked, voice tight. Charlie squared her shoulders.
"Because I need answers."
James studied her. The stubborn tilt of her chin was the same, but there was something new in her, something wary.
"Who else could be the father?"
His voice was sharper than he intended. Charlie flinched, but before she could answer, another voice broke the tense silence.
"She could be mine."
James turned, and there he was, Ethan Cross, his former best friend, his former business partner, and the only other man who could claim paternity. Charlie swallowed.
"Ethan."
He stepped forward.
"You should have told me, Charlie."
James felt the anger coil in his chest, not just at Ethan, but at himself. He had loved Charlie once. Had she really betrayed him with Ethan? Lila's small fingers tightened around Charlie's hand, sensing the tension.
"Mommy?"
Charlie bent, smoothing Lila's hair.
"It's okay, baby."
James wasn't so sure about that. Chapter 3: The Test. The results would be in tomorrow. James spent the night pacing the length of his waterfront estate, staring out at the dark sea. If Lila was his, everything changed. If she wasn't, James hated the thought of Ethan winning again. Charlie had been his first, his greatest love, and when she had vanished, it was Ethan who had been there to pick up the pieces of James's life, only to betray him too. The next morning, Charlie arrived alone at his office. James stood, watching her carefully.
"You have the results?"
She nodded.
"I thought we should open them together."
James took the envelope, his pulse steady, even as his fingers trembled. He slid his thumb under the seal, pulled out the paper. He read it once, twice. His breath left him in a slow exhale.
"It's Ethan, isn't it?"
A shadow crossed her face.
"No."
His stomach clenched.
"Then."
She met his gaze.
"She's yours, James."
His heart thundered, but he kept his voice even.
"You weren't sure, were you?"
Charlie looked down.
"No."
James exhaled slowly. He should be angry. Maybe he was, but looking at her now, seeing the regret in her eyes, the exhaustion in her stance, he knew what fear looked like. And he knew one thing for certain: Lila was his daughter, and he wasn't going to let her go. Chapter 4: The Truth in the Past. Later that night, James found Charlie on the beach, staring at the waves.
"You should have told me,"
he said. She sighed.
"I didn't know how."
James hesitated.
"Why did you leave, Charlie?"
A tear slipped down her cheek.
"Because I loved you."
His chest tightened.
"That doesn't make sense."
She turned, her voice breaking.
"I was pregnant, James. And your father?"
She swallowed.
"Your father made sure I knew I wasn't good enough for you."
James went still.
"My father what?"
Charlie wrapped her arms around herself.
"He paid me to leave, and I took the money because I was scared."
James felt something dark rise in his chest. He'd spent years wondering why she had left, hating her for it. And all this time, he reached for her.
Charlie.
She shook her head.
I didn't come back for this. I came back for Lila.
James ran a hand through his hair. He had spent so long believing in betrayal. Now, for the first time, he saw the truth. He hadn't just lost Charlie. He had let her go. Chapter 5. A Different Forever. The next morning, James stood on Charlie's porch, Lila's laughter drifting from inside. She opened the door, surprise flickering in her eyes.
I told my father to stay the hell away.
He said simply. Charlie's lips parted.
James?
He stepped forward.
I lost you once. I'm not losing you again.
Her breath hitched.
You and Lila.
James swallowed.
You're my family, Charlie. If you'll have me.
Tears shimmered in her eyes, and this time, when James reached for her, she didn't pull away. The end.